You guys can just either be shooting that 14 pages.
I just thought,
Yeah. I just sent her the link.
This is the 12th year.
I thought it was done last year. Everyone said last year. Are you going?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you guys, absolutely.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is, of course, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ininewak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of the long-awaited new novel from science fiction author Robert J. Sawyer, The Downloaded. Durch mir applaud. Many thanks to Shadowpaw Press for publishing this book and for making this evening a reality. It has been far too long since we've had Robert J. Sawyer behind a microphone here at the store, so I'm very pleased that we can rectify that this evening. And I'm also so happy that you could all be here both in person and virtually to celebrate with us. In just a moment, he will take my place at this podium to present and read from the book. Following the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you're here in the store, please just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with the microphone. It's not that we don't trust you to project your voice, it's just to ensure that those watching at home can hear the questions. And if you are one of those people joining us on YouTube, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to tonight's author as time permits. I'll be back at the close of the event just to briefly review signing procedure, but for now I have the immense pleasure of introducing this evening's special guest. Robert J. Sawyer has won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year, as well as more Canadian Aurora Awards than anyone else in history. The ABC TV series, Flash Forward, was based on his novel of the same name. Rob is a member of both the Order of Canada and the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. The Downloaded is his 25th novel, following such previous bestsellers as Quantum Night and The Oppenheimer Alternative. In the words of Robert Charles Wilson, the Hugo Award-winning author of Spin, The Downloaded absolutely sizzles with fascinating ideas. You want space travel, a ruined Earth, virtual worlds, a cast of relatable characters, and a glimpse into the labyrinth of human destiny? Look no further. This book has all that and more. To tell us more, please give a very warm welcome to Robert J. Sawyer.
Thank you so much, John. It's wonderful to be back at McNally Robinson. I start with an apology because this past weekend was KeyCon, the annual science fiction and fantasy convention here in Winnipeg. Venerable convention I've attended many times in the past, but my book tour schedule had me in Salmon Arm, British Columbia on the weekend instead of here. So I know there's some fine KeyCon people here, and for those who are watching online, KeyCon, Victoria Day weekend every year in Winnipeg, Manitoba, one of the few remaining general fan-run science fiction conventions in Canada, well worth supporting. My apologies for missing it this year. I was, as I just said, at Salmon Arm, British Columbia, and they had a bunch of us reading at their opening sermons. I happened to be the keynote speaker at the conference, but they had a whole bunch of people doing readings, and a lot of them started with incredibly long preambles about what they were going to read. And here's a pro tip. If you have to do a long preamble about what it is you're going to read, you've picked the wrong thing to read. So with that said, the only preamble I'm going to say in the spirit of the land acknowledgement that John made is that this novel was written where I live, which is in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, which is indeed the unceded land of the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. And with no further ado, damn thing about self-driving cars, of course, the laws vary from state to state, but back then in Massachusetts, the cops could send a signal from headquarters that prevented all automobiles in a given area from turning on. They did that as soon as the woman walking by reported Mitch Aldershot's corpse tumbling backward out of his garage as the garage door rose up, revealing me standing there, holding the bloody garden shears I'd killed him with. So my getaway car was as dead as Mitch Aldershot. Sure, I made a run for it, but Boston's finest had no trouble tracking me on street cams, and I was tasered and arrested about 3 blocks from the scene of the crime. My eventual trial was pretty open and shut on the actual murder rap. That woman had made a video on her phone of the events immediately following Aldershot's death. The big question the jury deliberated about was whether I had premeditated killing him. Weighing against that notion was the fact that I'd shown up at his place with no weapon. But supporting it was the reality that I'd tracked him down, traveled to Boston, and deliberately confronted him with the intent, at the very least, of assaulting him. That the murder weapon was simply an object at hand, or the garden shears, was immaterial, the asshole district attorney asserted. In the end, the jury sided with the state. I was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years with no possibility of parole for 35. 35 years. My daughter had turned 8 during my trial. That meant she'd be 43 by the time I got out, probably with children of her own. My grandchildren. My lawyer, Padma Chopra, said she'd appeal, but despite what you hear, you don't automatically get another kick at the can. Unless your counsel can show that the judge screwed up somehow, maybe overruling an objection that they should have sustained, or incorrectly advising the jury on law, you don't get an appeal. And I didn't. I'd expected to be hauled off to the state pen, but then something odd happened. Instead, Stella Rosen, the head of the Massachusetts Department of Correction, had me and Padma summoned to her office. 50 years of hard time, Rosen said as I sat in a chair opposite her clutter-free oak desk. Or 35, I countered, if I get parole. She leaned back in her swivel chair and interlaced her fingers behind her short graying hair. True, true, and for the sake of argument, let's assume you would. Bet your ass, I said. You've heard about those astronauts who are going to head off to Proxima Centauri, asked Rosen, a non sequitur, a term I'd learned from Star Trek, if I'd ever heard one. Sure. They're going to freeze their bodies, putting them into hibernation for the 500-year voyage. And they'll upload their consciousnesses into a quantum computer that'll stay here on Earth, right? I guess. Well, continued the director, we're part of an international pilot project along similar lines, although no one is going to go anywhere in our case. Instead of putting prisoners in a penitentiary, we're giving them the chance to be frozen with their consciousnesses uploaded until their sentences are all over. I'm offering you and Ms. Chopra that option. I'm sure I looked dumbfounded. Why on earth would I agree to a bullshit scheme like that? Well, first, the virtual reality accommodations are much nicer than an actual prison cell. Also, you're in your own silo, as they call it, your own isolated environment. Everybody you interact with will be a simulation rather than a real human being. No need to worry about bullying, prison rape, or anything like that. Look at me, I said. Do I look like I have to worry about bullies? You did at one time, no? That's what brought you here. And you wouldn't believe how many people go to prison thinking they'll be the alpha and come out broken. Yes, you're a murderer, but you're not a career criminal. You have no idea how tough these can be. No sale, I said. Wait, let me finish. First, if you agree to participate, your sentence will be reduced to 20 years. That's better than getting parole in your case. We want the entire pilot cohort to go into and come out of their individual virtual prisons simultaneously, so we can study them as a group. But the real plus is this. We run the quantum computer holding your consciousness at 24 times normal speed. Yes, you'll feel 20 years go by. Lots of time to reflect on what you did. We'll make sure you do that. But only 10 months will pass here in the outside world. 10 months, I repeated softly. That's right, and your frozen body won't have aged a day during that time. You won't come out of prison an old man, but still a vigorous guy in his 30s. I thought about my daughter, Annabelle. I could serve my sentence and still be out before she turned 10. Instead of having her having to listen for decades to people telling her what a monster her father was without me around to explain, I'd be there with her as she grew up. Her first day in Scouts, her first day in middle school, her first date, and the boy or girl better get her home on time. Padma spoke, surprising me with an unexpected area of expertise. I didn't think you could simulate a reality that much, not and still have high resolution rendering. Ah, yes, said Rosen, you're right. Computers simulating immersive reality usually operate at slower than normal clock speeds, not faster ones. But that's because a user can suddenly decide to change locale to say, a forest in Madagascar. And all of that has to be rendered from scratch, which takes a lot of time and processing resources. But our project deals with people who have, by definition, been deprived of their freedom of movement. We only have to simulate an unchanging prison cell and a couple of other places, and we've already rendered those in high definition. Speeding up the system clock works just fine for our limited purposes. Screw all that, I said. I don't get why you do this. What's in it for the state? Rosen leaned forward. Simple economics. This costs a tiny fraction of what it does to imprison someone for decades. No food needed, no guards, and my criminologists believe we're much more likely to get a rehabilitated ex-convict out of the process. What are the risks? Asked Padma. A specialist will take you and your client through a detailed informed consent process. And yes, there's always the possibility that something will go wrong. That said, the chance of dying undergoing this procedure is less than a quarter of that of dying a violent death during a 35-year prison term. And there's zero chance of you dying of old age after being frozen for only 10 months. I'll have to think about it, I said. The woman smiled, but it was a mirthless grimace. Of course, we can have you moved into Cedar Junction until you make up your mind. And those were my two choices. Go straight into a state penitentiary or give this crazy plan a try. There was no third scenario in which I got to go home, got to collect one more hug from Annabelle, got to sleep one more night in my own bed. I looked at Padma, who lifted her hands in a "it's up to you" way, and then I turned back to Rosa. All right, I said, count me in. So that's a scene from The Downloaded, where John would say, yes, you can applaud. You don't do this thing where you pretend to applaud. There's a video here. The world has to hear the applause. Like, what the hell is Sawyer doing? Nobody's even applauding. Geez, that was a bomb. So, The Downloaded, John mentioned this is my first novel in a while. That's true. This was my COVID-19 novel. I originally had envisioned writing a completely different novel. Some of you know this book, although it's being launched this month in print, came out 6 months ago as an Audible original on audible.com. They paid me quite a handsome amount of money to have a 6-month exclusive window prior to the print and ebook edition. Ebook's out today as well. And I originally pitched them a AI, artificial intelligence takes over scenario. And at the time I pitched it to them when they first approached me about doing something for them, it seemed that there was still some freshness possibly in that territory to explore. And then Star Trek Picard did a season about AI takeover, and The Orville did a season about AI takeover simultaneously, and Westworld was on HBO about AI takeover. And so I talked to the people at Audible and said, listen, did you want that proposal, or do you want to be in business with Rob Sawyer? And we would just want to be in business with you. Okay, so forget that. Forget the thing you bought and I agreed to write for you. We're entering this COVID-19 crisis, and we're all starting to live metaphorically uploaded lives. We're not going into the office. We're telecommuting. We're not going out to dinner. We're ordering in. We're not seeing our friends in physical space. We're interacting with them online. But at some point, that is going to come to an end. Now, when I pitched this, we all thought it was going to come to an end very quickly because we thought people would be sensible during COVID-19. Well, never, P.T. Barnum said you never go broke underestimating the intelligence of the customer. And indeed, it turns out you can never make the wrong bet by underestimating the intelligence of the human race, because it took us forever to deal with COVID-19 instead of very quickly dealing with it. But we were inevitably going to have to metaphorically download back into reality. And when I teach science fiction writing, which I do from time to time, one of the things I say that's a very good engine for generating science fiction stories, you take something that's metaphoric in the real world and treat it as literal and see what that story is. So that is what the downloaded is all about. And I want to say something about the cover. Can you see that there, YouTube people? Ooh, it's like late night 3D cam. The cover here of the downloaded, the art graphics are by Avery Olive from Bibliofic Designs, and I think she did a terrific wraparound job. But as she is quick to point out, I chose the typography. And there are two fonts on the cover, which I adore. And they probably don't go together, but they are both heavily associated with classic science fiction. In 1974, Franz Joseph published the Star Trek Starfleet Technical Reference Manual and established that microgramma extended bold, which my name appears in at the top here, is the official Starfleet font. And in all kinds of 1970s science fiction productions, including the 1972 TV series Search on NBC, the movie The Forbin Project, and so forth, this typeface was used. Now, this typeface is, the original version of this typeface is called Moore Computer, M-O-O-R-E, and probably in honor of Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, Moore Computer. And it was made by the Letraset company. If you remember back in the day, rub down lettering, well, nobody does that anymore. Nobody had a good digital version of Moore Computer. So a guy decided to make a knockoff of Moore Computer. So the name of this actual font is Lazenby Computer, because it's not as good as Roger Moore, but it's, George Lazenby quality of the font. So the fonts are supposed to say hard science fiction on the cover of the book. Whether they do or not, I don't know, but that was my little indulgence there. Anyways, that's some of the backstory of the downloaded. The experience with Audible was terrific. If you have an Audible account, it's free. You can just click on add it to my catalog. You don't have to use one of your monthly audiobook credits. That said, and I should say Audible was terrific to work with. They asked me, who did I want to have narrated it? And I said, I don't know, how about Brendan Fraser? And they said, okay. So we have Academy Award winner Brendan Fraser as the lead narrator. They were wonderful to work with, but I always had planned this to be a book, a novel. And to me, as a novelist, as a reader of books more than anything else, even though I have a degree in broadcasting, this to me is the final, ultimate form of this particular story. I had a great time writing this. I had some health challenges. I won't go into them, but I had some health challenges other than COVID, which I had twice while I was creating this book. So it took longer than it should have taken to write. But in the end, I was very grateful that Audible commissioned the project. And that had an interesting effect, though, because when I started in publishing, the publishers that I was dealing with, Ace Science Fiction, Tor Science Fiction, two of the biggest science fiction prints in the United States, all they wanted were your print rights, and usually just in North America. As time went on, they started wanting other things for no increase in the advance, you understand, but they also wanted your ebook rights. And then of late, meaning the last decade or so, your audiobook rights. And all of that became non-negotiable. No additional fee. They should get some royalties, but no additional upfront for all those rights. Well, Audible had already taken all those rights. Had taken the audiobook rights, but only the audiobook rights. But that meant that my traditional Big Five New York publishers or Penguin Random House Canada, who I've been dealing with, weren't interested because they couldn't have the package of rights that they have to tell all the authors it's non-negotiable. They couldn't say, oh, except if it's Sawyer, we don't insist on that. So I ended up with a very small press that I made a deal with where I keep the ebook rights. He's got 3 years of the print rights, but I want to acknowledge John Taves mentioned him very kindly, the name of the press, Shadowpaw Press. Edward Willett is the publisher of Shadowpaw Press. He is and has been for many years an author for Daw Books, a very fine science fiction and fantasy imprint, also the publisher of Winnipeg's own Gerald Grant, right here in the front row. Gerald, I'll just shine a light off your head. You don't have to wave your hand, but he's right there in the front row. That's Gerald. But Edward Willett has been astonished to see the caliber of writers who have been coming to him. Obviously, he was pleased to have me. Dave Duncan, who was one of Canada's great science fiction and fantasy authors. Dave's passed away, but his estate has come to Shadowpaw, and they have just released Dave's last science fiction novel published posthumously called The Traitor's Son, S-O-N. Not the sun up in the sky, but somebody's child, to paraphrase Star Trek there. And Arthur Slade, S-A-L-A-D, Arthur Slade, the Governor General award-winning YA author, is now also published by Shadowpaw. So it's turned out that when the Big Five says non-negotiable, a lot of authors say, well, there are other alternatives, and Shadowpaw has turned out to be an excellent one for me. So thank you to Ed Willett, the publisher, and thank you to Audible for starting this whole thing, and thank you to you for coming to hear me talk about the Download It. I think at this point, I'd be happy to entertain questions or comments, if there are any. If John has, and the YouTube camera is fixed on me, but trust me, a man with a microphone just appeared in the wing here.
So if there are any questions, please feel free to put up your hand and I'll just wander over to you. And if you are watching on YouTube and have a question for Rob, please just write it in the chat.
Hi there, Rob.
Hi.
I read your book over this weekend, actually, and I didn't know at the time I was reading it there was an Audible book, and so I really enjoyed it. It was very fast-paced and wonderful. And as I was reading, I'm like, those are some ideas or themes that I've seen in some of your books over the last 25 years, except for Neanderthals and dinosaurs, I think, which you won't find, spoiler. But I was just wondering, was the form of Audible similar that you wanted to try to bring in some of these themes that you've done over the years?
That's a very good question. So it was, I knew when Audible approached me to do this, that they were going to give away the product. Now, at this point, you people here either have been dragged by somebody who's already a Robert J. Sawyer fan, or a Robert J. Sawyer fans yourself. But when you throw something to the wind, you're getting a much larger audience. And then when they agreed to my suggestion, and also the suggestion of the director, Greg Sinclair, who sadly has passed away since in the past 6 months, since this came out as an audiobook, it's his last project. Since they agreed to Brendan Fraser, we had a huge number of people we knew were going to be coming in who were Brendan Fraser fans, but not science fiction readers. So I thought, this is an opportunity not to be missed. I wanted to shake up people's preconceptions of what science fiction is if they're not habitual science fiction readers. I've been at war with, and he's utterly oblivious to it, but I'm at war with George Lucas. Because in 1977, all of the good work that had been done for decades in cinema and television and in literature of trying to make science fiction respectable, make people understand that science fiction isn't juvenilia, it is serious adult literature. With 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, and Planet of the Apes. Now, I know Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is playing right now. The original Planet of the Apes is a very sophisticated Swiftonian satire about the front page headlines of 1967, the year it was made. Race relations and the fear of nuclear war. That's entirely what that book is about, that film is about. But then Star Wars came along and conflated science fiction. Star Wars isn't science fiction, it's fantasy cosplay as science fiction, masquerading as science fiction. It's about wizards, a magical force. It's absolutely a fantasy thing. And it, despite the fact that it says a long time ago this is a paraphrase of the opening of the fairy tale, a long time ago in a land far, far away. Even though it identifies itself as a fairy tale, people didn't know that science fiction could be about philosophical issues. It could be about prison reform. It could be about the rights of artificial intelligence, of different ways to constitute a society. And I thought, this is an opportunity not to be missed. So I was interviewed recently by a podcast. You know, most science fiction novels, they take one idea and just elaborate it and explore all the ramifications. You've got about 8 different ideas in here in a obviously reasonably slim book. And I said, yeah, I wanted to give the smorgasbord, a sampler, a taster's menu of science fiction to a swath of people who never would have encountered science fiction before. Whether that was worth doing or not, whether, you know, was the right choice in the long run for Audible's purposes, or even for my publisher, I don't know, but I think it was the right choice for me. The other factor was, this is my 25th book, but it may also be my last book. I don't know if I'll write another book after this. Now, people will say, yeah, you said that before, right? But it may be my last book. And so I wanted to, because I thought in Quantum Night, which was 2 books ago, was going to be my last book. And I wanted in Quantum Night to kind of put a capstone on a number of themes that I'd been dealing with. And then I did the Oppenheimer Alternative, which is an alternate history about the Manhattan Project. And I thought, that's a great, I'm very proud of that book. I think maybe the best book I've ever written, but it is not typical Sawyer. And I thought, I can't go out like that. I got to go out, my final bow has to be reiterating the themes that I've been dealing with, the nature of consciousness, artificial intelligence, diversity, the value and power of diversity amongst human relationships. And so this was very much intended to be a signature. If it is my last book, I think it's a fine collection of Sawyerisms to go out on.
Was there any other questions?
There was another hand. Oh, well, there's the Reverend Dr. Professor Emeritus James A. Christie from the University of Winnipeg, who co-sponsored one of my 2 honorary doctorates, one of which is from the University of Winnipeg, and I'm delighted to see you here. However, I do say in one of my books, never trust anybody who has more letters after their name than they have in their name. But that said, Reverend Jim.
20 years of friend, 23 years, 21 years of friendship, and this is what I get. It's gotta be my math skills. So a couple of questions, actually, Rob, if I could. Of course, Barbieheimer was the huge event of last summer. And as I recall, you had some significant critique of the Oppenheimer project, perhaps in light of your own book.
Oh, absolutely.
I agree with you, was one of the best you produced.
Oh, thank you.
So that may call it part A, because part B of the question is not entirely unrelated, at least it relates to your work. One of the books I found the most charming, or the trilogies I found most charming, was the Wake, Watch, and Wonder.
WWE trilogy.
And it raised to my mind the questions, because I'm theoretically a theologian and an essayist by vocation. It raised to my mind the question of what is artificial intelligence, and in fact, can intelligence, if it's intelligence, be artificial or not? So if we breach some of the points at which we're not simply having feedback from that which we have fed into some form of technological system, whether it employs quantum mechanics or we eventually achieve that breakthrough, will we in fact, in this book, raise that question for me almost immediately? Are we at some point going to be able to distinguish between forms of intelligence? And even if we do, does it really matter a hill of beans?
So 2 questions. First one, yes. Second one, no. Next. No. So you're right. Oppenheimer and the Barbie movie were the 2 big movies last year. And everybody expected me to be on Team Barbie. And I actually thought, sorry, no, they did not. Well, because of my collection of the dolls, they figured they had to be on Team. No, I have lots of action figures, but not one of them wears pink. They expected me on Team Oppenheimer, obviously, because I've written this book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. In fact, I thought Barbie was a terrific movie. It's beautiful. The art direction is beautiful. It is filled with social commentary, which good science fiction should be. It was inventive and creative. And the Oppenheimer movie, Christopher Nolan's movie, I thought I was angry about, because it isn't really about anything. And I think that the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer is a hugely interesting story about a guy who went from you know, kind of like the Ian Malcolm character in Jurassic Park, who's the guy that Ian Malcolm was talking about, the scientist. They spent so much time asking if they could without bothering to stop and wonder if they should in terms of creating the atomic bomb. And the journey of J. Robert Oppenheimer from being the guy who simply, as he termed it, when he was given the brief of can you create an atomic bomb, he said, well, it's a sweet problem, which was his favorite phrase for a tricky but appealing problem to try and solve in science, a sweet problem, to the guy who ended up being a peace advocate, I think is a very, very significant journey. I think the Japanese were very right to be offended by the Barbenheimer meme that this thing that had killed tens of thousands of Japanese was being lumped in with, oh, isn't it fun that they're cross-promoting it with a movie about a toy? Even though I think the movie about the toy was more profound than that. And also the complete absence of any Japanese reaction, the horror, the reality of what happened with the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think was criminal. Also, Oppenheimer himself was an incredibly nuanced and charismatic character. His students imitated his mannerisms, not out of mockery, but because they found him just so fascinating. Oppenheimer, in fact, was duck-footed, and you would see him walking through the halls at UC Berkeley with students walking duck-footed behind him. He had strange speech mannerisms that they copied unconsciously because they were so in awe with him. And he was also this incredibly charismatic ladies' man. Cillian Murphy looked like Oppenheimer, but brought this one-note brooding performance. So I was quite disappointed in the film. But what are you gonna do? It's now nobody else is gonna make a film, including not mine, Oppenheimer book, but if any, it's the definitive view of Oppenheimer for this generation. And possibly for all time. And I think that's unfortunate. Now, to your question about artificial intelligence versus non-artificial intelligence, you know this well, that Alan Turing proposed many, many years ago what's called the Turing test, which was if you are having a conversation with something that you can't see. In Turing's day, it was by teletype. You couldn't see whether it was somebody typing it or a computer putting out the answers. If you ask it any number of questions for as long as you want, and you can't tell whether it's a machine or a person giving the answers, then you have to concede one of two positions. Either they're both equally intelligent, the human and the machine, and self-aware and sentient, or neither of them are. And the default would be that they both are. So yeah, artificial intelligence is a chauvinistic name. It's us saying that anything that you have isn't real. What we have is real intelligence. We have real feelings. We have real emotion. We have real reality, and you are some kind of ersatz fake version of it. And this is absolutely one of the themes of this book. I am of the opinion that if you can't tell the difference, then there's no difference. As I argued in my novel Quantum Night, a large part of which is set here in Winnipeg, the only, Descartes famously said, cogito, which is I think, ergo, which is therefore, sum, I am. Cogito ergo sum. So it's the only thing I can be sure of is that I exist. If I'm thinking, then there must be a thinker. But I can't prove that you exist or you exist or you exist. I have to take by analogy that if I have an inner life and exist, and you seem to be doing the same kind of things I'm doing, you must have an inner life, not be a robot. But it's only by analogy. You extend that analogy to anything that seems to be behaving in an intelligent way. So yeah, I think, it goes back to 1968, I mentioned 2001: A Space Odyssey. Dave Bowman says of Hal, but as to whether he has real feelings, I don't think a question anybody can honestly answer. And the answer is, he seems to have real feelings. They seem as real as yours. You probably have to concede that they are real. So yeah, it's a chauvinism to use that artificial as a way of distancing. Somebody else? Oh, way at the back. John is running in slow motion, doing an impression of the $6 Million Man.
Thank you so much for repeatedly coming back to Winnipeg. And I remember talking to you at Pemicon, which was a joy. And I was
the talking was the joy. Pemicon, Yeah, so much.
And I enjoyed reading Quantum Night and Oppenheimer Alternative. Brilliant.
Thank you.
But I also have read, I was talking to you about Asimov, and I just finished reading again Prelude to Foundation, which I consider to be an absolutely fabulous book, especially today, even though it was written in 1988. And I think part of the job of a science fiction writer is to really tackle the tough issues of a time, whether they do it in metaphor or some other way. So how does the Downloaded meet 2024?
Sure. And it's interesting you mentioned Asimov because I don't want to spoil something for you, but in The Downloaded, a character who is a robot quotes Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. In fact, one of the characters is a human roboticist whose name is Sidorov, who is from the same little tiny town in Russia where Asimov was born and was inspired to become a roboticist because someone from a little town like this can become famous roboticist, maybe me too. That's what he decides to do. The robot quotes Asimov's laws of robotics. And this goes to Jim's point here, which are the 3 laws of robotics. 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction, not acting, or through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey all orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the 1st law. 3, a robot must protect its own existence, except where such protection would conflict with the 1st or 2nd law. And as well, it's perfectly reasonable. This is exactly what we would require of our toaster or anything else. How does this meet 2024? The robot turns around and says, let me just change a couple of words and read this to you. And the robot says, a slave must, sorry, and I knew this off by heart a moment ago, but it's the camera, a slave may not injure a white man or through an action allow a white man to come to harm. 2, a slave must obey all orders given to it by a white man, except where such orders would conflict with the 1st law. And 3, a slave recognizing that it is the white man's valuable property must protect its own existence, unless such protection conflicts with the 1st or 2nd law. So Asimov is saying, here, we just have to do this and we'll be perfectly happy between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, because we will definitionally, legally enshrine and in programming, in code, that they are subservient to us without the slightest asking of what the F is wrong with us that, as the Grinch said, if I can't find a reindeer, why, I'll make one instead, right? And we're saying, well, if we're not allowed to have slaves, we'll make slaves instead. So I think this issue, this fundamental issue of our incredible desire to constantly want to make subservient things and own them and deny them fundamental liberty is, in fact, if not right now, in the next 5 years, something we're really going to face if machine intelligence, artificial intelligence continues to progress at the way it's going. And so the debate is very much central to this story. The novel also, you haven't read the book yet? Okay, then the novel also deals with LGBTQ issues. The novel also deals with, one of the central conceits of the novel is that you saw in the part that I read, this character, Roscoe Kadulian, has committed a murder as an act of aberration in his life, being punished for it. But the other main characters, these are a bunch of prisoners. The other main characters in the novel are a bunch of astronauts, both of which are undergoing cryogenic suspension for various reasons. And astronauts, we famously say, have the right stuff. Thomas Wolfe coined the phrase. It was used as the title for a movie and about the Mercury 7 astronauts, and subsequently for a miniseries, Mercury 7 astronauts. And we definitionally say that if you're a prisoner, you got the wrong stuff. And I wanted to juxtapose those two because so much of what Thomas Wolfe and that generation, the 50s that led up to the creation of the manned space program, which started in the 60s and continuing on today, which is a hyper-competitiveness, a hyper-macho-ness, is synonymous with what we now call toxic masculinity. And I wanted to highlight that so much of our mythology about the space program was really celebrating toxic masculinity, and that so many of the people that we dismiss as being the detritus of society, the criminal, the element that has been found guilty of crime, is often victim of circumstances, not, yes, everybody's responsible. I'm not saying you have a right to say, it's not my fault, I didn't do it, I shouldn't have, but that the circumstances and the world that we've created is not a land of equality and opportunity. And I think that's very much a 2024 theme as well. That's very, very present in the downloaded.
There is a question from someone online who asks how you would differentiate between an android and a helper robot.
Okay, that's a very good question. So, and the question was, how would I differentiate an android and a helper robot? I mean, an android just definitionally is a robot that looks like a man. So C-3PO in essence is an android, and R2-D2 is not an android, he's a dustbin or something. But the spirit of the question is somebody like Commander Data, that kind of android, versus the robots that probably put together a large part of whatever automobile you own was probably largely assembled by a robot on an assembly line. And the difference, I think, is not for, the question is, who gets to decide? And this goes very much back to the civil rights issue, right? The founders of the United States wanted to say a person of color is 3/5 of a person. You ask a person of color, they don't agree. Obviously, they don't agree, right? So the answer is Data, famously in an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation written by my friend Melinda Snodgrass, called The Measure of a Man, it was that very issue. Data is put on trial because Starfleet has decided he is property, and since we don't know how he works, we might as well disassemble him to see how we can monetize or reuse this technology. And Data fights for the right to say, I have self-determination. So the question is, I throw it back in hopefully good-naturedly, is it's not up to me to say. If something says, I am, cogito ergo sum, I am a person, I have rights, then who am I to gainsay that? If there's been a lesson of history, it should be that those who have said only men have rights, or only white people have rights, or only property holders have rights, or only people over a certain age have rights, or blah, blah, blah. They've been wrong every single time when they've decided that they should be the ones deciding instead of the people in question being the ones deciding. So how do you distinguish? The helper robot will never say, I didn't like putting together that car, or I didn't, yeah, I know it's nice to get to make a Lexus, but you know who owns Lexus? It's Elon Musk, and he's kind of owning that. I didn't want, instead, he doesn't own Lexus, he owns Tesla. But the helper robot will never say that. But the other robot will say, I have the rights that you have, and I defy you to take them away from me. And I defy you to look into your own history and ever find a time where you've taken them away from somebody else and it turned out to be the right decision. If it was never the right decision in the past, what possible moral justification can you have now for saying it's the right position today? But they didn't applaud the reading, I'm just kidding.
Wanted more, Robert.
Oh, thank you.
As they say in the House of Commons, a supplementary,
Yes.
as it were. So one of the things that I think drew me to science fiction before we were thrown together by the Justice Department,
Yes.
it doesn't necessarily mean we had the wrong stuff. It just means the Justice Department for once had the right stuff.
That's true. That's true.
That's another story entirely. But one of the things that drew me to you as somebody who practices theology and to a degree philosophy related to it, and is by some people's assessment diametrically opposed, was the fact that a friendship isn't based on agreement or disagreement, preferably healthy. It's based on a common concern or a common interest. What matters to you, And I think what people tend not to realize about science fiction, but could well go to school on yours from the first book that you published way back, is that the principal question that I've identified that really you and I both hew to is, what does it mean? What are the implications? What does it mean to be human. And I wanted to acknowledge that because this is a gift of science fiction that so many people overlook or ignore. It's either light entertainment, or as to say it's space opera or a fairy tale in a cosplay outfit. But in terms of that, it's just simply an observation about what I think, again, already in the first 40 or so pages of the download is just, it leaps off the page to me. Yeah, that's what police wants to cover once again in case somebody missed that. But the other thing is, and I just can't resist because I don't think I've ever asked you this. I know something of how you feel about Star Wars. And after this evening, if people are in any doubt, they'll be able to dig deep into their memories and recognize it. But could you say something about Roddenberry and Star Trek?
Yes, Star Trek was hugely influential in me, probably the biggest reason that I'm a science fiction writer today. And Spock resonated a great deal with me, not for the reasons that might seem obvious, that, you know, his whatever, pointed ears, but he resonated with me because he was from two cultures. And I happen to be a dual citizen. Although I was born in Ottawa, my mother was an American grad student in economics from the University of Chicago, in theory temporarily in Canada when she gave birth to me. And so she went to the American Embassy in Ottawa and registered my birth as a foreign soil birth to an American national, temporarily out of the country. Boom, I was an American citizen from my birth as well as a Canadian citizen. And I have a Canadian father and an American mother. Spock, of course, has a human mother and a Vulcan father. And so we had some very high-level conversations at dinner. And we used to, and it probably, it wasn't the CBC News that was on in our house. My mother prevailed, and it was the CBS Evening News, and it was Walter Cronkite. And certainly during the 60s, Walter was talking about race relations. He was talking about nuclear war. He was talking about all these fraught issues. And I thought this, and as a kid, I was still fascinated by this. And then primetime television came on, and nobody ever mentioned any of the fraught issues. In fact, you think about it, Get Smart was set in Washington, D.C. It was about a government agency, and they never once touched on the Vietnam War. But Gene Roddenberry did. Gene Roddenberry was talking about the Vietnam War. And he was talking about race relations, and he was talking about personal responsibility. He was talking about all kinds of interesting issues, not in every episode and not always profoundly, but in most of the episodes, and often with enough that you wanted to chew over after watching the episode with somebody else, argue, talk about it. And I think that more than anything else opened my eyes to what science fiction could be. Take as when I look back now, my ancestry as a science fiction writer is, yeah, Roddenberry is in there, but it's really H.G. Wells, who was doing social commentary. And he went on to be much more of a social reformer and better known in his lifetime. Now, nobody remembers, but he was a historian and writer of social justice tracts and so forth. All that's endured is his science fiction works. But what he was doing in science fiction was raising difficult issues with disguise and metaphor so that people who would not normally be receptive to a discussion about them would get sucked in to the story and hopefully at the end would have a moment of reflection or epiphany. So for instance, The Time Machine is not about a journey to the year 802-701 AD. It is about the evils of the British class system, and importantly, not just about the evils of the British class system for the underdog working class. Everybody knew they were getting a hard break. Everybody had read Dickens, The Christmas Carol, knew that Bob Cratchit had a terrible life under Ebenezer Scrooge, but that it was terrible for the leisure class as well. And that's the whole point of The Time Machine, the whole point of, but if you said, hey, you in the leisure class, the only people who could buy books were working class and had the disposable income and often weren't literate. You in the leisure class there, I want to harangue you for hours about how the way we've structured our society is not only ruinous for the people who aren't obviously benefiting from it, but it's ruinous for you too. You're becoming ineffectual, feckless, incapable of looking after or thinking for yourself. It will be your ruin. You find somebody on the street corner who wants to harangue you like that, you make a beeline in the other direction. You say, here, I've got a story about a man who's invented a machine and he gets to travel to the future. You've never read anything like it. And it was so groundbreaking that the name he gave to that machine, the time machine, is still the name we use because nobody's come up with a better name and there was no antecedent for it. Moby Dick has a subtitle, as you may know. The subtitle is right on the nose. It is The Whale. The subtitle, Time Machine, I just saw the first edition at the University of Calgary. They have an exhibit on right now of Wells' first editions. The Time Machine, we don't use this anymore, an invention. But it was all about that. And War of the Worlds is not about Martians invading Earth. It's about trying to show the evils of British colonialism, trying to show how reprehensible, how horrible we would feel if somebody came into our land, crushing us underfoot, and with no regard for the fact that we were here originally. It is as timely a message as one could ask for today with the land acknowledgements that we did at the beginning of this, this recognition. And Wells was sounding that alarm in 1898, saying, look, what we're doing with this to the peoples of the world is wrong. And that's the power of science fiction. And Roddenberry is very much in that vein. Whereas George Lucas, of course, he's doing Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, and he was playing with myth and so forth. The work, well, I would say about Star Wars. So The Simpsons, as you all know, has been going on forever. I watched Sunday night's excruciatingly bad episode about Bart taking a brain in a jar to school. But back when The Simpsons was good, Milhouse was running for class president. And he said, and if I'm elected, we're going to have a curriculum based on the ABCs of science fiction. Asimov, Bester, and Clark. And another kid goes, Bester? What about Bradbury? And Milhouse goes, I'm well aware of his contributions. Well, that's the way I feel about George Lucas and Star Wars. I'm well aware of his contributions. But H.G. Wells, Gene Roddenberry, Mary Shelley, who is the grandmother of all science fiction, the creator of the genre, these are the people that I like to think I stand on the shoulders of and follow in the footsteps of. Anybody, or I don't know where we are time-wise, John?
Well, certainly, we do have time for one or two more.
One or two more questions.
There was one that came in online where someone was wondering, do you think you might ever go back and update or remaster your older novels? Say,
No.
The Terminal Experiment to today's technology.
That's a very good question. The Terminal Experiment is my novel from 1995 that won the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America's Nebula Award for Best Novel of the Year. And it actually was reissued about 15 years ago by Penguin at the States and in Canada. And they asked me then, even if I wanted to update it. And I did not, and I will not, for two reasons. One is it's a perpetual motion machine if you're updating your novels to deal with changes in technology. And, so many mystery novels, for instance, something's banal as a mystery novel. Why don't you update it to the 20th century? Well, because there's security cameras and forensics and the crime would be solved like that, right? The science fiction novel, part of the fun from the author's point of view and the reader's point of view is seeing what was predicted. And remember, it isn't necessarily the author's intention to accurately predict the future. As Ray Bradbury, the author of Fahrenheit 451, or as we call it here in Canada, Celsius 233, liked to say, my job is not to predict the future, it's to prevent the future. Now, he must be spinning in his grave because we're burning books again. We're banning and burning books. Unbelievable after we had his warning more than half a century ago against doing that. But to go back and redo it, the negatives for me are, one, you'd have to keep redoing it every 5 years, every 10 years. And then at some point, your story is so, it's of its time. The story is of its time. Two, the story is a snapshot of who I was when I wrote that story. And you come back and you've got 25 or 30 years of reflection. That's the story about whether we could ever find scientific proof for the existence of the human soul. That's what I thought at that moment. And it was, I don't want to erase that. I know, speaking of George Lucas, of course, he went and started, who shot first, right? Han or Greedo? Depends which cut of the film you see, right? Of Star Wars Episode 4. Either Han is a cold-blooded murderer, drug-running mercenary. He was running spice, which is a drug, or he was, shot in self-defense. And which one is the actual version? And I don't want to do that. This is what I wrote. This is what I wrote. It's, you know, and people say to me about various novels, you know, oh, well, you know, hominids. And they said, well, you know, what about this? What about that? And I said, well, they didn't have that in 2002, and the novel is set in 2002. So no, the answer is no. I understand the spirit of the question. And the final answer to that is, if I'm going to do any more writing at this point, it'll be to do something new. I think despite the very good question about Asimov's Prelude to Foundation, which is a very good book, I think Asimov, for instance, wasted the last decades of his life in what I thought was a fool's errand of trying to unify the Foundation universe and his robot universe. Instead of giving us new and fresh visions, he was going back to things he had created when he was a teenager or in his early 20s, and in his 70s revisiting them. And also another example is, as much as I very much enjoy Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was originally a BBC radio drama, and then a novel, and then a television series, and then a movie, and he kept going back, either writing sequels to or reimagining the core material. I'm on a rant here right now, angry about the fact that, you know, the top science fiction movie in theaters right now is Dune Part 2, right? Dune came out next year, will be the 60th anniversary of the first publication of Dune. The world seems to be frozen in his view of science fiction with what was being done more than, well, 3 generations ago now, 60 years ago, instead of delving into the exciting stuff that I and my brethren like Gerald are writing today. So no, I'm not going to go back. I'm going to keep pushing forward.
And does anyone have a closing question before we go to closing comments from Robert? Yes.
I had a long preamble, lots of stuff to say, but
I Pligliae and Actu Flagit, that's the preamble of the Constitution.
In closing, a number of years ago, we sat in this very room and we watched the premiere episode of Flash Forward. You happened to be in Winnipeg.
I did.
And we were so lucky because during every commercial, you gave us all kinds of anecdotes.
I did.
Very disappointing to hear that, you know, the next novel may not happen. So my question is, will there be more flash forwards? Will any of your novels make it?
I hope so. We came repeatedly, Flash Forward was on ABC in 2009, 2010, and you're exactly right. I was in Winnipeg for Thin Air, I think, the Winnipeg International Writers Festival. And we had, got a big, what qualified as a big screen TV in 2009, like a 27-incher or something, and watched the network broadcast of the premiere of my TV series, Flash Forward, and in the commercial breaks, I did commentary. And ever since, we have been trying to sell various things. I've had the WWW trilogy repeatedly optioned, Red Planet Blues repeatedly optioned, everything. All the time there's interest. But the sad reality is, come back to those names I mentioned, Arthur C. Clarke. Okay, what's your favorite Arthur C. Clarke film? Well, it's 2001, because there is no second one to speak of, right? Maybe 2010. What's your favorite Asimov film? Oh, there's a really bad film of Nightfall, and there's a movie about robots that they branded with his name, iRobot, that has nothing to do with him. Not until Foundation TV series recently, there have been any Asimov for ages. What's your favorite Heinlein? Well, there's Starship Troopers, which is kind of a satire of Heinlein, and there's Puppet Masters, which is a forgotten film at this point. So even the biggest foundational names, they either go back and keep yanking the Frank Herbert teat, as somebody said recently on Facebook, the cash must flow, or they just, nothing gets made. So the fact, you know, it's like saying to your friend, and I'm very grateful for the question, it's like saying to your friend who won the lottery, okay, when are you gonna win the lottery the second time? Or it's like saying about the Russian dancing bear. It's not that it dances so well, it's that it dances at all. Right? I hit the jackpot once. I made an awful lot of money. It boosted my career. I made great friends with people on the cast, David Goyer and Brandon Braga, who wrote the pilot. Dave was our showrunner. I have nothing but good feelings about that. We keep trying, but the chances are minuscule. They're minuscule that mine or Gerald's or Bev's or Shayla's or anybody who's a writer in this room will ever get something made. And that I had it happen once was in a lot of ways just pure miracle, but I'm grateful for it. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
And thank you so much, Rob. We'll now move you along to the signing portion of the evening. So please do feel free to come up and just line up down this way. You can have a copy of the downloaded sign before you pay for it at the cash desk. Please do pay for it at some point before you leave. We're so incredibly grateful to Shadowpaw Press, to all of you for joining us here this evening, for your attention and for all your questions. And of course, we're so enormously grateful that Robert J. Sawyer could join us tonight. So thank you all so very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, John. Yes.
That would be my favorite app.
That's a good point. That's a good point. That's right. That is a good point. Yes,
Not exactly a high bar.
That's true. I've been on book tour for 3 weeks.